Hi, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Cover Crops for Idaho Small Farmers. And it looks like we have about 19 people here on this webinar, so that's great for a Tuesday night. I hope you guys are at home and having a good evening, and I hope that this webinar can provide some useful information to you and your operation. So again, this is your Small Farm 2018 webinar series. And tonight I will talk about cover crops. This particular grower on the left is one of our conventional large-scale growers in the Magic Valley who grows sugar beets. And he's been quite an advocate for cover crops over the last few years, ever since he's tried them out. And it's really nice to see large-scale growers adopting these practices as well as small-scale farmers. So some webinar tips before we get started. You'll want to close all other programs running on your computer, as the GoToWebinar can use a lot of bandwidth. You'll want to check your sound, make sure you don't have any problems with clarity, speed. And if you do, you can switch to the phone, which the number is provided in your email. And you'll want to mute your computer sound when using the phone. Throughout this presentation, I will have some breaks to identify and answer questions, but go ahead and start typing those questions in as we proceed, so that way when we get to those moments, we can address your questions right then and there. And also type in the chat or question box if you are having any issues with the IT, and we can also try to provide some support. And there are some handouts. I've provided 2 handouts, which I will highlight later on in this presentation, but they are on your toolbar, the GoToWebinar toolbar. And if you would like a copy of this presentation, I apologize, we were unable to add it to this toolbar as of tonight, but we will be able to email that to all the attendees later this week. So. Oops, excuse me. So tonight, my name is Lauren Golden, and in addition to myself, I have my colleague Jennifer Jensen on the call to help me with the questions and polls and answer any IT issues if we run across any. But my name is Lauren Golden. I'm tonight's presenter, and I'm an extension educator in Blaine County with the University of Idaho Extension. Blaine County is in the south central part of the state. And Sun Valley is where I'm located. I don't necessarily, my office is in Haley, but if you're in other parts of the state, not familiar with Blaine County, that's where I'm at. My main role within Extension is looking at sustainable soil management practices. And I've been in this position for over 8 years now, and I first started looking at dairy compost. We have a lot of organic growers in our area and a lot of conventional growers that are looking at ways to minimize chemical fertilizer use, as well as to build up their overall soil health. So I've done a number of trials with some colleagues on dairy compost, since that's an abundant resource in the Magic Valley, and we're always looking for ways to take some of that concentrated nutrients and spread it out. So we did some trials looking at optimal application rates, looking at the nutrients you get from those applications, and what type of organic matter you can expect. And over the last 4 years, I've spent a lot of time looking at cover crops, and we've done a lot of work throughout southern Idaho doing on-farm demonstrations with small and large-scale growers adopting cover crops and testing them out on their sites. A lot of research that is on cover crops is often in the Midwest or areas around Oregon or California, and in different cropping systems. So we really had to look at what cover crops work well in Idaho, especially in our high desert environment here in southern Idaho, and also what works well with the particular crops that are commonly grown in our area. So I'll highlight that today, and I hope it's very useful for your operation. And we'll get, at the end and throughout this presentation, there will be breaks so we can really specifically answer questions. Since it looks like there's 22 people on, as we go through this presentation, we can maybe specifically answer some questions that are pertinent for your operation and questions you have for cover crops that are specific to your system. So I want to start with one poll right off the bat, and I want to know, how often do you use cover crops, if you have used them at all? And I have Jennifer Jensen helping me run this poll.
Yes, so that poll is launched and you should be able to see that and click on your answer, either never, sometimes, always, or not applicable. And so far we've got about 70% voted so far. We'll let that go a little bit longer. And all right, so got about 80% that have voted. Looks like it stopped there, so I will close the poll now. All right, and then I'm going to share the answers here. So
okay, so we got, excuse me, we got a good mix. We have few people that have been using cover crops for a long time, which would be under the always category. And we have about a little less than half that have sometimes used it, and 35% that have never used it. So this should be a really good presentation for all of you. That's great. I'm really happy to see that. Okay. Now my next slide is actually another poll. I'd like to know where everyone is located. Because cover crops can be somewhat specific, especially since Idaho is so diverse climatically, this will be good information to make sure we tailor what seems good for farms throughout the state.
And folks are voting here. We've got about 75% voted. We're back up to that. Right, we got 90% voted. We'll wait just a few seconds longer and then I'll close it. All right.
Okay, everyone looks pretty spread out, which is good. We have a good mix of the state, 32% North Idaho, 21% Southeast, and then 11% specifically where I'm located in Central Idaho. And then we have 26% Southwest and 11% outside of Idaho. Okay, that's good to know. So tonight, this is kind of where we're going, our roadmap. I want to first talk about why cover crops, why are they important, why are cover crops such a big buzz these days, and how are they useful for farmers. And then I want to get to the nuts and bolts about cover crops 101. How do you actually implement cover crops, and how do you do a good job of implementing it and have success looking at adopting cover crops or incorporating cover crops into your system. And then if we have time, I'd like to also touch on grazing cover crops. That is a really useful practice, especially for small farmers who might have diversified operations, and we're looking at both cropping and animal systems. Cover crops work really well in those types of systems. And then we'll wrap up. This webinar is scheduled to be an hour and a half, and depending on questions, it can go that long, or we might be done, you know, an hour and 15 minutes. So we'll just see how it goes, but I wanted to let you know that that's the time frame that we're looking at. Okay, so why cover crops? Cover crops over the last decade really have received a lot of attention from the USDA as well as EPA because of their ability to deal with non-point source pollution. So as we know in the United States, the statistic shows that agriculture contributes the majority of the issues to non-point source pollution. This image in the middle is from the Chesapeake Bay area, which back decades ago has more famously been noted as a watershed that received lots of attention and now is managed very well and very stringent. So this watershed in particular had lots of non-point source pollution issues, where we're looking at, in this image, we're seeing sediment runoff. So that's topsoil that is coming off farms primarily. And although topsoil is valuable and we don't want to lose that material from our farms because it has organic matter in it, but secondly, this sediment contains chemical. So it's containing nitrogen and phosphorus that is polluting these watersheds. So as a result of the concentration of nitrogen or phosphorus from point source from a non-point source area to a watershed, we start to look at hypoxia issues and watershed ecological problems. So over the years, and especially right now, I'd say in the last 5 years, cover crops have received lots of attention from the USDA because of their innate ability to deal with this non-point source pollution. And another reason is because it's very cost effective. It's actually more cost effective to deal with non-point source pollution on site rather than going into this, on this image, going on a watershed scale level and trying to deal with that issue there. We really have to look at the site. And cover crops can be a very cost-effective way for farmers to implement practices that ultimately benefit them and can then solve some of these larger environmental issues. One thing I don't highlight in this presentation, but at the end I can talk about some of the NRCS programs where there are cost share incentive programs for farmers to adopt cover crops, so they can essentially help provide some of the money for the seed as well as anything else to help farmers adopt these practices. So why cover crops? The main reason is reducing non-point source pollution. So again, on a federal level, cover crops have received lots of buzz. One of the goals on the USDA level is they want to see 20 million acres of cover crops planted by 2020. And we're not quite there yet. Most of this initiative is targeted in the Midwest, but as more and more research is done throughout other parts of the state, especially areas like Idaho, which we have some areas being dry land, we have lots of different diversity. We're looking at what works best for these particular growers. So secondly, the other reason why cover crops are important is because they reduce sediment loss. So that's that topsoil loss that we were seeing in that Chesapeake Bay area. And topsoil, as a farmer, is very valuable because that's really where our organic matter is. Our organic matter is going to be in that first 1 to 2 inches of our soil. So we want to look at cover crops as essentially armor for our soil to keep that topsoil on our land. And then another benefit, the other benefit that is, so the above are more conservation practice minded as to why cover crops are important. But then from a farmer's standpoint, soil health really is the big benefit for cover crops. So cover crops help increase organic matter, and they'll provide an organic source of fertilizer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these. So on the left image, we can see an example of cover crops. This is a cover crop that essentially any type of plant material that is planted can essentially take up nutrients. And what the cover crop is hoping to do is that it's hoping to gather up those nutrients, store it in its plant growth, and then essentially let that material decompose into your soil. Now, the middle image is a spring thaw. So imagine we planted a cover crop in the fall. Rather than having nutrients leach out of our soil profile, and when I say leach, it just means it's going beyond the root zone and it's no longer available to our plants. So we don't really want that. So these cover crops that are planted either throughout the year or in some cases in the fall after a harvest of a cash crop, that cover crop is going to capture nutrients. It's going to capture that nitrogen, capture that phosphorus, use it for its own benefit. And then we're going to look at that plant material as it decomposes to re-release those nutrients for the next season when we're actually planting our cash crop or perennial system where our cash crop is constantly being replenished in a pasture setting, for example. So that's the way cover crops essentially help with the non-point source pollution issue. They're helping to absorb nutrients, using it, and then slowly acting as a slow release fertilizer for our cash crops. And then on the right, this is where it really gets at this soil armor. So this is an image in eastern Idaho, and especially in southern and eastern Idaho, it's really common for farmers, especially large-scale farmers, to leave their fields fallow in the winter. And what that creates is a wind erosion issue, as many of you know how windy that part of Idaho can be. Here's an example of a real news article where Highway 15 was closed for a period of time due to this wind erosion, creating visibility issues, creating hazards, and essentially the highway having to be closed for a period of time while they were able to get that off. So one thing that we're promoting in this area is cover crops as a winter fallow system, putting cover crops on that land and acting as soil armor. So it's keeping that topsoil on there and protecting it. So as we look at the soil health, this is where the farmers really benefit. We really want to look at cover crops as a way to improve soil health. And research has been able to identify how cover crops contribute to soil health. And primarily we're looking at the fact that they can provide nutrients, they can provide nitrogen, especially if they're a legume. These pictures here are nodules, root nodules from a legume. So the legume cover crops are nitrogen fixing. They're able to take nitrogen from the atmosphere, use it for their own benefit, creating protein in their plant tissue and root biomass, and essentially creating free nitrogen for us. So, and then the other benefit is phosphorus. They can also take up phosphorus and some potassium. But the biggest bang for our buck with legume crops is focusing on that nitrogen. Now, the second soil health benefit for a farmer with cover crops is the organic matter benefit. So as this plant material breaks down, it's essentially releasing sugars and proteins that are then digested by the soil microbes in our soil. And what's nice is the soil microbes actually, as they digest this material, they produce glues, waxes, and resins. And that's what essentially creates more complex soil aggregates in our system. Now I'm going to show this next slide. Now on the left, it really highlights what I'm showcasing is how diverse and how full of life our soil really is. And there's billions of unidentified bacteria, protozoa, fungi in our soils, and we're still learning about it as soil scientists. But what they can note is that different species feed the biodiversity in our soil. So it's noted that kind of like humans, as a grass, for example, which is going to be more sucrose-based, have more sugars, as it releases those sugars, some species are going to readily want those sugars. They're going to want that fast food, fast calories, whereas our legumes, which remember we're producing nitrogen, now has protein in it, and as that nitrogen breaks down, it's a protein form. And other microbial species are more prone to eating that protein because they know it's a more sustained intake for their substance. So what's nice about the cover crops is that they're essentially feeding these microorganisms. So the reason that the USDA also promotes cover crops, in addition to solving non-point source pollution issues, is because we realize that soil is a living and breathing thing. And as a farmer, you know this. So your soil essentially is going to affect how well your crops do. And as we continue to produce on our soils, we're essentially mining our soil for our nutrients. So in order to replenish it, a conventional grower would use a commercial fertilizer, but it's a very quick fix. It's only just provides the nutrients for that plant. It doesn't really provide organic matter or provide nutrients for these microorganisms. So as farmers, we come in looking at compost and manure and other additions that are going to add that organic matter. But cover crops have been found to actually provide more of the food, essentially, for microorganisms than simply applying compost. And the combination of the two is even better. So again, it's a way that you're feeding those microorganisms different foods, essentially. So that's been really interesting to discover as cover crop research continues. Now, this soil picture on your right, you can imagine which soil you would rather have. And this gets at this microbial life inside the soil. So you can see these worms are creating pores throughout the soil, so air and water and nutrients can move throughout that soil better. And when I mentioned that as microorganisms microorganisms digest cover crops. They release these gums, waxes, and resins. And these gums, waxes, and resins is what helps build the humus in our soil and essentially builds these more complex soil bonds. And as we have more organic matter in our soil, we're able to hold nutrients more and hold water more as well. So we'll be able to talk more about these in more detail as we specifically talk about cover crops. Now, the list of benefits of cover crops goes beyond that, which is really exciting, which is why I really like talking about cover crops and experimenting with cover crops, is they can also provide a habitat for beneficial insects as they bloom. They can also minimize weed competition. This can happen with some species that are able to germinate quickly in the fall or spring. We're able to capture opportunities when other weeds might have come up. We're able to let these cover crops come in. Some species, which I'll highlight, are very vigorous, so they're really able to minimize the weed pressure. And some growers say, well, now that cover crop could be my new weed. But most growers that work with cover crops realize that the cover crops, they want those on their field. They're not a weed, they're a benefit. So they want that cover crop to then be their new weed to grow vigorously on their cropping system. Cover crops have also been able to reduce water use. Essentially, there's two ways that happens. One is, especially in our climate where we have snow, especially if we plant cover crops during the winter, we can capture that snow, leave it on our soils longer, so when we come back to that field in the spring, we've held moisture longer. One of the growers I've worked with in cover crops here in Peekaboo, in southern Idaho, he can tell a difference from the fields that are fallow versus the fields that he's been able to plant cover crops on as he's essentially kept adding on to his operation with cover crops. He can notice a difference with the water capacity in those soils. And the other reason water use is reduced is during the summer, we're creating a shade over the soil, so we're reducing evapotranspiration, which is pertinent for some intercropping operations. Cover crops can help reduce the need for herbicides and pesticides, and that's exactly through what I mentioned. They're able to provide a habitat for beneficial insects, and then they're also able to help with the weed competition. So a grower is able to reduce the amount of herbicides and pesticides needed. They can reduce soil compaction, and they can provide forage. So this picture on the left shows a variety of blooms, and this gets at the beneficial insects, the habitats that can be provided. And then the compaction issue is another thing I wanted to highlight on this slide. Actually, compaction can be reduced by two species primarily. On the right, we have our taproot species, which is our brassicas that have large taproots. Those are able to break through hard pan, break through soil with their dense taproot and reduce compaction. But it's also shown that our grasses contribute a lot to reducing compaction because their fibrous roots can spread out. So again, we're creating pore space throughout our soil through these roots. And that's an example of one of the turnips we've experimented with the grower on the front slide there. So why cover crops? Continuing on that conversation, I mentioned the forage potential. We've done a lot of work now with grazing cover crops, and we're still doing work because there's still lots of questions to answer for producers and how it works. But essentially under a management intensive grazing system, cover crops can work really well. Or if you have a perennial pasture, cover crops can essentially be that new pasture for you. And then weed competition, you can see how this seeding mix at the bottom is full of brassicas, grasses, and legumes, but you can really see the brassicas are the species there that really germinate quickly and can provide lots of weed control. So that's an example where we took out a clipping of that species. You can see that no weed is going to have a chance in those mixtures. And then on the right, we have an example of volunteer barley where we did not seed cover crop mix in the spring. And then on the right, you can see where we did seed our cover crop mix. And you can see that how much forage is in that on that left-hand side of that field that grower is then going to rotate their cattle into. So I'd like to do another poll, and I'd like to inquire about what cover crop benefits are you interested in? And you can select more than one option here.
I'm launching that poll now, so you should see that. Got about half of the folks voted. We'll give you a little bit more time.
Now, one question I did not ask, but I think would be relevant, if the attendees could type in the question box just a line that describes their operation, whether that's what type of crops you grow, what type of animals you might graze, just something so I can understand what type of cropping systems and animal operations people are utilizing. So it looks like the poll closed. Everyone is interested and has been interested in soil health benefits. 90% looking at an organic fertilizer, which is great, and 60% forage. 100% is also looking at weed control and pest management, and then 5% other. I can imagine that a lot of you might be organic growers, or maybe not certified organic, but looking at ways to minimize outside inputs. And cover crops are a great tool to help with that process. So I'll move on, but please type in some information about your system, and I'll let Jennifer stop me maybe in a couple minutes to identify some of the operations. So we're going to get started now in the next section of the presentation, which is looking at cover crops 101. So how do we get started with cover crops, and how do we have success with cover crops? So I will talk about cover crop management goals, which we talked a little bit about. We'll talk about species selection, how to select species and what species are good in Idaho and have proven to be successful in Idaho. And I might hear from some of you as to what species you might have tried or have had good success with. I will say most of the trials I've done obviously have been in southern Idaho, but I do know my colleagues who have done cover crop trials in northern Idaho have used similar species to what we've used. So, and then how to implement. So management goals, as we've talked about, this is where you as a grower really need to identify what are your ultimate management goals. And it might be more than one, as that poll indicated, but this is gonna help identify your species. So we're gonna, as you identify your management goals, by the end of this presentation, you're gonna be able to tie it with what species, note species plural, because there's gonna be more than one species you'll use that will really target your management goal. So an obvious management goal is a source of organic fertilizer. So you're looking at nitrogen. You might be an organic grower and you need nitrogen in your soils. Next is increasing soil health. So you're looking at organic matter. Maybe your soils are depleted. Maybe you know you need more organic matter. More organic matter is better than less. So any grower might be looking at improving their soil health through the increasing organic matter. You might be looking to protect your soil if you're in an issue where wind erosion is an issue or just general erosion. From rain, for example, that could be another issue. Northern Idaho, where you're going to be looking at soil protection. You want to put armor on your soil. Moisture retention and weed control. Again, this is going to be specific to what species really are going to target these management goals. You might be looking at basic forage, meaning you might not want to spend a ton of money on a really dense, protein-rich mix, but you do want to get some forage benefits. And maybe that's where you start. You might look at a basic forage mix, and then once you experiment with that, you can then build onto it, and you might be then looking at maximum forage, where you want to make this feed source one of your major feed sources for your animals. You might be looking at reversing soil compaction, and then you might be looking at pest management. So again, note these goals, write them down, and we will circle back to which species are really going to be able to target these management goals. So species selection, when you're selecting your cover crop species, they're broken down into 3 types. We're looking at legume species, which are going to be our peas, our vetches. Those are the ones that are going to be able to fix atmospheric nitrogen. So that's where we're going to really look to focus on nitrogen fertilizer if that's our main goal. Grasses are another one, and those again come in a variety of grasses, but grasses are another cover crop variety, and then brassicas. So I'm going to go through each of these. But what you will find out, and as you read more about cover crops, is that we don't just look at one species, we're really creating a mixture of species. And as I noted earlier with the soil microbe slide, research has shown that different species are going to provide different foods for soil microbes. So essentially, if we want our soil to be full of different microorganisms, then we're going to want to feed different microorganisms. So we're going to want to provide different foods for those microorganisms. So that's where we really look at these cover crop cocktails. And those might be anywhere from 3 to 8 species and up. But you'll see what I recommend for especially new growers, something starting small, maybe between 3 to 5 species. And as you play around from season to season, you can then start to experiment with, okay, this species really didn't serve my purpose, or it didn't really compete well under my conditions. So I'm going to take it out of my mix and I'm going to try this other species. So, but that's what you're really looking at, is you're looking at a mixture. It looks like a yummy salad to eat right there on that slide. So the benefits of each: legumes, as I mentioned, are going to fix nitrogen. They're going to have that high protein, high crude protein if we're looking at a forage benefit. So they're going to have the high forage quality. Grasses are going to provide good organic matter, so we're really getting at that soil health issue with grasses. It's also going to help with the soil compaction. As I mentioned, their fibrous roots are really going to help with soil compaction, creating more pore space, creating more space for air, water, and nutrients to flow throughout our soil. And grasses can also bump up our forage yield. So if we're looking at a forage mixture, we're going to want legumes in there for the forage quality, but the grasses are what's really going to help bump up our tonnage. And research we've done in Idaho really shows that we can really double our tonnage depending on the grasses we add to our mixture. So that's important if that's a main goal of yours. And then brassicas, they're going to be our species that scavenge nutrients. What's interesting about brassicas is they can do a lot of things. They don't actually fix nitrogen, but because they're tap roots, they actually scavenge nitrogen. In trials we did here in southern Idaho, we found that our brassica species had similar amounts of nitrogen contained in its plant material as legumes. And that's attributed to the fact that these species are scavenging nitrogen and notably also phosphorus from the soil, using it for its own growth. And then we're hoping, and in theory, as we measure it, that material then is going to be released in our soil. So the brassicas, again, kind of are one of our, I guess, the star of the show in a lot of mixtures for growers especially. They can also reduce soil compaction. They can help control pests. The sugar beet grower that I highlighted in the beginning, he actually uses a specific mustard variety for an organic fumigation system. So he had nematode issues in his his sugar beets. So he uses a specific mustard variety to act as a fumigation system to control those nematodes. And he uses them year after year as he rotates around his fields. Brassicas are also really good at weed control because they germinate quickly and they have a large canopy. And then they're also beneficial for forage quality. They also have that high crude protein because they're scavenging nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil. And in grazing studies we've done, we found that a lot of the species, or cattle I should say, the cattle actually prefer the brassicas over some of the other species, over the other grasses and legumes in the mix. So the brassicas really are palatable to the mix. So one of the handouts I have attached to your toolbar is cover crops for high desert farming systems in Idaho. So this is specific to research we have done in Idaho, where we've looked at a number of cold hardy or warm season varieties that we wanted to test and that we suspected would do well in Idaho. And within each of these, within this publication, I go through legumes, then grasses, then brassicas, and I list species under each of those categories. And I highlight characteristics of each of these species. So it's very useful. It's kind of like an ID card for these species. And it's a quick guide to look at to see if that species seems suitable for your needs. For example, in canola, I see cold hardiness. So I'm going to highlight whether it survives winter or not. What are the optimal planting dates for canola, summer and fall? What are some species to mix canola with? Plant with any cereal, cover crop, or a legume. And I might highlight that if you want other species in the mix to be more prevalent, then that's where I might note in this document, lower your CD rate of the canola because it'll outcompete some of your other species. So that's where you start to make this cocktail, and you can start to play around with the seeding rates of your species depending on what, again, going back to your management goal, what management goal do you really want to benefit from? Jen, do you mind highlighting some of the comments regarding the operations?
I would be happy to. Some folks are small, they have a home garden with goats and chickens. Another participant is reclaiming an old hayfield for orchard, woodlot, apiary, small market garden, possibly animals such as pigs in the future. We have a high altitude dryland grass hay producer. They also have Himalayan yaks. Another participant's considering this for research and considering expanding their home garden into a market garden. We have some folks with pasture for horses and alfalfa for horses, and they'd like to move to premium hay and cows that graze whole property where needed. Other folks, another participants in the planning phase. And then some others have veggies and flowers as well as animals, cut flowers, both perennials and annual crops, fruits and vegetables, and more pasture for horses as well. So a bit of a mix there.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, good. Okay, well, as I go through these slides, and if things seem pertinent to some of those operations, then I'll be sure to highlight that. But again, type questions as you have them, because we will get to a question slide after the end of this section. And if you have a specific question about your operation in terms of cover crops, we can specifically address that. So I wanted to highlight just a short list of legumes. Again, this is just a short list, but as you discover, as you start to purchase cover crops, you'll realize there's a lot of different varieties of cover crops. So legumes, some of the species we've tested and that we found success with that are commonly used by growers is Austrian winter peas or forage peas. Again, these are all in your publication as well, so you don't necessarily take notes on these. Chickling vetch is another example where we're going to have lots of protein, but again, a perennial species that is a little bit slower to compete in a mix, but provides other benefits such as flowering and beneficial insect habitats. Hairy vetch is another one. Most of you have heard of hairy vetch. Hairy vetch is actually attributed to producing the most nitrogen out of any legume, essentially tested, I guess, out of hundreds of them. But hairy vetch, for example, in some cases has been able to show that it can produce 76 pounds the acre of nitrogen. So hairy vetch definitely produces lots of nitrogen for producers. In our studies, Austrian winter peas would produce anywhere in the range of 40 to 60 pounds of the acre of nitrogen. And again, what's tricky is that it's not always readily available right then and there, and the soil chemistry can change from day to day. But those are some examples where we were able to identify, well, here's an example of what type of nitrogen could be essentially produced for a farmer from these species. And I can highlight more of that information, especially if you email me, I can provide you some specific details. Their clover varieties are also popular legumes. Those are good for perennial systems. They're not as good for a one-time planting, or meaning you're going to plant 1 year of a cover crop, or you know, a fall into a spring, and then put in your cash crop or a vegetable system or whatnot. Clovers are better for a pasture or perennial system, as most of you know, those of you who have horses or have grass and hay operations. And then our Vika peas is another one that we really liked because it winter killed. It essentially died in the winter. So it allowed easy access for farmers to come in and replant or essentially plant their cash crop the following spring. But one thing to note is that our Vika peas was difficult to find. So I will highlight, that's part of your cover crop plan, is identifying your seed source and getting started early. So next, grasses. These are some, again, our short list of examples. You know, there's tons of wheat and barley, different varieties, but again, that's what's commonly grown in Idaho, and those are perfectly good for being cover crops because they'll provide that organic matter, or perhaps a forage benefit. Triticale is a grass species that we really like to use, especially for grazing aspects. It's not too expensive, and it does really well under most conditions throughout Idaho. So triticale is a big one we like to promote. Sorghum Sudan grass is a warm season annual. You'll see some of the varieties in the larger picture on the right that we tested of sorghum Sudan grass. So you can see that's a full season, excuse me, not a full season, but that's a spring planting of sorghum Sudan grass. So again, it's a warm season annual. It can get very large, produce lots of biomass, and can really provide lots of organic matter. You can see all that residue. That one's a little bit trickier, obviously, depending on your use, but sorghum Sudan grass is a benefit if you're grazing, and as long as you're careful about your management as to when to graze it. It can be very useful for farmers looking for organic matter or looking for that grazing. And then pearl millet also is a good grazing species. It's very drought tolerant, and lots of good protein, and is onless, so it's good for grazing as well. So again, all these species are listed in that publication, but I wanted to just highlight some of the species just to get your mind thinking about what species you might want to work with. Brassicas, again, there's lots of brassicas, and there's so much information on brassicas as you start to look around, but some of the species we've tested were daikon radish, oilseed radish, purple top radish is another one. There's lots of radishes. There's lots of turnip varieties, canola, and then mustards. And those all can be very beneficial, and I wouldn't necessarily choose one or the other over the other. Brassicas seem pretty hardy and can do well under most conditions. So that's when I would specifically maybe work with a seed dealer to say which brassica species do they recommend, and you might say I'd like to look at a radish or a turnip variety, and here's where I'm located, and help me identify a species that's going to provide the management goals I want. This is an NRCS cover crop chart that is also very useful, and I wanted to put it in this presentation for your resource later on. But this essentially groups a bunch of different cover crops, and you can see at the top it identifies which species are cool season, which species are warm season. Then it starts to identify broadleaf versus grasses versus legumes. And then it also provides details at the top and within each of the periodic box for each species, whether it's an annual, biannual, perennial. What about its relative water use? It's going to showcase that. And then the plant architecture, which is very important considering, especially if you're going to intercrop it in a vegetable operation, you're going to want to look at how are these species going to grow, and you want to make sure they're not going to compete with your vegetable operation. So that's a good species, a good resource to go back to and reference. So, as I mentioned, cover crop mixes is essentially what you're looking at. You're looking at a cover crop cocktail. And this is where you really get to dabble in going back to your management goals to identify which species and how much of each species. Playing with that seeding rate, it's really going to be where you start to control a little bit on the field as to what management goals you're going to get out of these cover crops. So here's kind of how cover crops are going to do in a mix. This is information that identifies how they're going to work together. So grasses and brassicas are going to germinate quickly. So there are species that are really important for providing weed control. And they're also important when, say we harvest our crop late in August, we're running out of time before we're going to run into frost. We're going to want to focus on grasses and brassicas because they're going to germinate quickly and get above ground and start to produce enough biomass above ground that it made it worth it for us to plant it. If we have a short turnaround in the fall to plant a cover crop and let it overwinter, we're not going to want to plant a perennial or a legume species that's going to take a long time to germinate. Then we're going to run into the issue where we've spent a lot of money on the seed and we're not going to receive the benefits. So grasses and brassicas are going to germinate quickly in the mix, so they're going to provide that weed control, and they're also beneficial for when you're running out of time and you have a short window of time, either in the fall, where you're going to want to leave that species again to overwinter, act as our soil armor, or if we have a short turnaround in the spring and we want to get some biomass up before we plant our cash crop. And that could be seeding with a no-till drill our cash crop, so we can be seeding into this residue is the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is conserving our soil all around. So we're providing nutrients via the green manure, the cover crop, but we're not trying to till it in. We're looking at ways to preserve that material and preserve our soil aggregates and not break those up, which tillage does. But again, it depends on your operation, and organic growers, tillage is the main control of weeds. So again, that's a tool in your toolbox that you have to keep for your operation, and that's important in a lot of cases. Oops, excuse me. Grasses and brassicas are good if you get a late start to planting in spring or fall. So thank you, I already mentioned that. So legumes are going to be in our mixture. They're going to be the more expensive ones. They're going to cost the most. So we really want to make sure we've identified why we want that legume, and we want to make sure that we're going to get a benefit out of it if we're going to spend the money. Legumes, as I mentioned, are slower to germinate, so you're going to want to note that depending on your time schedule. And then you're going to adjust your seeding rates based on your germination and goals. So as I mentioned, if you're really looking for legumes to be the main showcase in your mix because you need that forage or you need that nitrogen, you're going to want to bump up the seeding rate of your legumes and minimize the seeding rates of your brassicas and grasses so that they don't outcompete your legumes. So that's an issue too. If we put an even seeding rate out, but we really want our legumes to do well, they're not going to have the opportunity to compete with those brassicas and grasses, which are going to germinate quickly. So that's something to note. And please don't forget to be typing questions as we go, because we will get to a question point here soon where we can start to answer some questions for you. So as we started with this section of the presentation, we talked about management goals. What are our management goals? And I want to circle back to, now that we've talked about species, what are going to make sense? And again, this should be very obvious now. And so something to note is, if we're looking for nitrogen, we're going to be focusing on legumes. If we're looking for soil health, we're probably going to be focusing on a mixture of all three species, but we might really heavily focus on grasses because they're going to really give us more of that organic matter that we want. So if we really want organic matter, let's make sure grasses are a big prominent feature in our mixture that we create. If we want soil protection, we might just want a species that's going to germinate quickly, maybe just the brassicas and grasses, and maybe just find the cheapest seed or species that does well in your environment. There's no need to spend a lot of money on a complex mix or expensive species if all you really want to do is provide that soil armor. So that's something to note is sometimes start small, Make sure not to spend too much. See the benefits in front of your eyes and observe, see how it works in your operation, and then start to tweak before you spend too much money on a mixture that maybe didn't work out as well. Moisture retention and weed control, again, that might be where we want something to come up real quick. So we're going to be looking at our brassicas and grasses to come up very quick for providing that weed control. And then moisture retention also gets at that canopy where we want to minimize evapotranspiration, especially if we're in a pasture setting and we're looking to graze. We might want to look at those brassicas. As we noted in those pictures, a lot of the brassicas have a wide canopy and can really provide a lot of protection for the soil. That's also a time in the winter where we want to, if we're expecting snow, if we're in an area that's going to receive snow, we might want to retain that snow moisture. So we might again want to choose a mixture that's not too expensive, that's really going to just provide that armor and a layer to capture that snow and keep it there, and slowly preserve it throughout the spring so that we can capitalize on that moisture for our cash crop. If we're looking at basic forage, we might want a mixture of all three of those species again. I would say a grass, a brassica, and legume. But I would, again, pick a basic mix that isn't too expensive. So when I say basic, you want to, as you start to talk to the seed dealer, you want to make sure you're not spending too much on something, especially if the animals you're grazing, you just need basic forage. For example, with poultry or pigs, you might experiment with something basic first to see how it works and whether that meets your nutrient needs. If you're looking at maximum forage, you're really going to be looking at those legume species to provide that crude protein and bump up the mixture of those legumes. And then tonnage, remember grasses are going to add that tonnage, so we're really going to want to make sure we have a good amount of grasses if we want to have yield as well. In addition to the crude protein, have a lot of yield. And then reversing soil compaction, we're looking at our fibrous roots, so our grasses, as well as our brassicas. And then pest management, as I mentioned, specific mustard varieties can provide that fumigation control for nematodes, or we might just be looking at general pest management by providing habitats or blooming environments for beneficial insects. Now the sequence options for growers in Idaho, we're really looking at three main, unless we're looking at a perennial pasture. You could potentially be looking at a summer fallow system where you're looking at a field that really needs to recover, you really need to bump up your organic matter, and let's say you have animals. Then you could plant a full season of cover crops and graze that mixture. And ideally graze it under a management intensive grazing system where we're controlling the animals, controlling the rate of grazing, and controlling that manure spread throughout the field. So we're really getting the most benefits from our animals, as well as their ability to control and utilize that forage. Or if we don't have animals, we might be looking at a summer fallow where we want to bump up the organic matter in a particular field or a particular site, and we just want to focus on growing cover crops in that field, producing nutrients, and just letting it go. Companion cropping is where we're looking at intercrop cover crops. This might be most pertinent for vegetable operations where we're going to be looking at seeding in between our rows with whatever equipment you have or available to you. This can provide the weed control and a slow buildup of organic matter and nitrogen in those rows. And then you could be looking at a winter cover crop where you're looking to plant in the fall as early as you can. Essentially, as soon as you're harvesting, be coming in with your seeder to plant those cover crops so that any of the volunteer species, grains, or weeds have the least opportunity to thrive, and we can go ahead and plant that cover crop in as soon as you've harvested. But essentially, that's a fall planting. You're letting that material stay, that residue stay on the soil over the winter. If it's species that are going to winter kill, then that residue will just be a mat on the soil, which is beneficial for weed control and retaining moisture. Or we're looking at species that are going to start also growing, come out of dormancy and grow a little bit in the spring, provide a little more biomass for us, and release those nutrients back for our crops. Another benefit I wanted to mention is combining cover crops and compost or manure. Research has shown that both of these materials essentially are a fertilizer, and they can be slow release fertilizers. But one way to capture on the nutrients within compost or manure is to have spread it out over a cover crop planting, and that those cover crops essentially are going to capture the nutrients, use it in their plant material above ground, and then slowly release that material over time. So it's a way to really hold that benefit from the compost and manure in your soil for longer, rather than having that material leach out. So I think we're at a Q&A period, because I'd like to hear from anyone who might have some specific questions. But let's first do this poll, which asks, what cover crops have you tried?
Okay, and I will launch that poll here.
And I believe you can select more than one. And I apologize, there should be a NA on here. So if you have not tried cover crops, I guess just don't reply to this poll.
All right, we've got about half of the folks voted. A few more coming in. I'll wait just a little bit longer before I close it. And looks like we have about 57% voted. Seems to have leveled out there, so I'll go ahead and close the poll.
Okay, most of you have tried, mixture of clovers, which is common in especially a perennial or grazing system. Clovers are going to be a go-to species. We have grasses, peas, and then just some trying brassicas. But I hope after this presentation, a lot of you will be looking to brassicas as a species that you might want to add to your system. Jennifer, are there any questions?
There are, yes. Before we get into specific types of cover crops or specific species, you talked about the soil and all the organisms in the soil, and Terry had a question. Terry mentioned that they've arranged to do a local soil test and is wondering where you advise testing, as well as should I expect the test to give me an idea of the microorganisms in the soil?
Yes, that's a good question. There is a Haney test. I forget the gentleman's name. Someone might know it on this call, but he's out of Texas. He's a soil researcher, and he's essentially created a soil test, and it's named after him. His last name's Haney, H-A-N-E-Y, and it is able to capture the life in the soil. And I believe it talks about, I think it captures kind of the respiration, so it's trying to capture essentially the microbial activity and how much respiration is going into that soil, because that would be attributed to the number of species. I believe there are soil labs that use that test, and I guess I cannot say which ones because I'm not sure exactly. Jennifer, do you know what soil labs you go with in Northern Idaho? Typically?
Well, typically either University of Idaho, or oftentimes folks will send samples down to labs in Southern Idaho. I do not know specifically which ones do the Haney test, and Linda did comment that his name, I believe, is Rick Haney.
Yes, thank you, Rick Haney. So that is one thing you can do if your lab does not test for that or have that specific test. You can look at organic matter, because any basic soil test is going to give you % organic matter, and that'll help clue you in to how your cover cropping is doing, or how your practices in general are doing, whether you've been doing no-till, or you've been doing cover crops, if you've been adding manure and compost, or you have animals in your system. You can look to organic matter, % organic matter, and what I like to tell producers is to test at the same time each year, whether that's spring and fall. Try to pick a general month so that you can compare samples from year to year. And if you don't want to sample every year, I would say sample every couple years and keep those soil results so you can start to track whether your organic matter is increasing. And then if your soil lab is able to do the Haiti test, then that's even better. You can really start to look at that microbial activity. But the organic matter in those soil results will also give you a snippet of that information.
Okay. Another question was more on equipment. You mentioned using whatever equipment you had to seed your cover crop, but they ask instead of a no-till drill and you use a seed spreader and go over it with a harrow. Anna asked about that.
That can be done. Pretty much what we recommend to growers is use what's available to you, and that can be done. Growers have done that. So really any type of planting equipment that you have or methodology that's available to you can work. One thing to note is that you might, if you don't have good seed to soil contact on your specific planting method, you might then want to just bump up the seeding rate. That helps to ensure that you're able to have a better stand if you don't. And then one thing to also note, if you are able to provide irrigation, it is good to do it during that 2 weeks of germination time. That'll also help your success, depending on if your planting method is less ideal or not as ideal as you would like. Then bumping up that seeding rate and providing irrigation, if you have that ability, will help that stand.
Okay, great. And Casey is asking, what cover crops work well in horse pastures?
And I assume you're looking to do a perennial pasture. In that case, I would look to do some perennial legumes, maybe some vetches and some clovers, and I would do some grass species as well. In the handout that talks about the cover crops for high desert farming systems, it goes through which species are perennial species, and that's what I would recommend if you're looking to make that a pasture perennial. And that's a little more tricky because you can't select as many species in some cases, but again, I would look to some vetches as well as those clovers. Those are your best options in this case. And then perhaps there's a field that you can do a planting of cover crops for forage, and maybe make it a smaller area where you can graze it if you have electrical fencing or you're able to move those animals, move those horses around. That could be an option too.
Okay. And one other question from Jody. They ask, would cover crops help with a plot infested with reed canary grass? Which could we try? And do we need to grow a cover crop for a few years before we might see weed control benefits?
Yes, I would look to depending on your purpose for that field down the road, I would look for a grass or brassica. And again, any of those brassicas that I mentioned, or grasses, since I don't know exactly where you're located, looking at those species will help identify which species you know will do well, grass-wise and brassica-wise. I would recommend a mixture of those two types of brassicas and grasses to plant in that area. And yes, depending on your planting method, whether you're able to use tillage for the weed control and then do a planting, that'll help. In that case, if you're looking to do a broadcast or something, or no-till, then it might take a couple of years. But we did do a plot in a severely infested Canadian thistle field, and it helped within 1 year of outcompeting that thistle. It's not going to completely eliminate the thistle, but it'll dramatically drop the population.
Okay. And one other question, which is actually just from myself, I'm curious, I've seen in seed catalogs sunflowers listed as cover crops, and just wondering if you have tried those here in Idaho, and or if it's just maybe too expensive of a cover crop for most farmers. Just curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have not worked with sunflowers, but you're right, it is listed as a cover crop. And I imagine part of that's because of their ability to act as armor for the soil, you know, whether that's providing a canopy, providing that beneficial habitat, providing shade, providing some of those other benefits that are listed. But yes, if I was a vegetable producer and its cover crops seem to be, excuse me, if sunflowers seem to be something you've used before and you've seen done in similar operations, providing other benefits, whether that's shade, etc., then I think that would be a good option.
All right, thanks. And right now that wraps up our questions.
Okay. Okay, so getting to, again, implementation. How do we implement cover crops? This is just a generic cover crop plan, very simple. This is if I was a grower and I was thinking about how I'm going to implement cover crops. These are the topics that I really want to answer. I want to first identify the species that I want to produce. And what I note here is that you really want to obtain the seed early. So I would start months in advance to when you want that seed. And I will show a slide coming up that identifies some sources for seeds. And it's certainly not a long list or, you know, the list of everyone available, but those are people that farmers I know have worked with and had success with. But the take home with selecting your species, after you select your species, is obtain the seed. And I would start working with a seed dealer that knows about cover crops and has been working with producers to create cover crop mixes. They'll make it a lot easier for you if they have some experience knowing about cover crops. And a lot of dealers are definitely on that page now. So they can definitely help you identify if you come to them saying, I'm looking for some brassicas and grasses, or I'm looking for some forage legumes. They'll be able to help you pull together and make sure that makes sense, and you can start to price it out as to how much you want to spend per acre. So planting date, know that in advance so you know, okay, after I harvest and here's my typical harvest date, I'm going to want to have that seed ready, have that planter ready, and be basically following my harvester or following myself as I harvest to plant that cover crop. And then planting method, have an idea of how that's going to look depending on your equipment, whether that's, as we've talked about, no-till or another type of planter, aerial seeding, however it might be, broadcasting. And then spring management, especially if we plant in the fall, how are we going to plant that, our next crop, for example, or if we planted in the spring, perhaps we are planting in the spring and we're going to do a full pasture. Since many of you on the call have animal operations, we're probably going to be looking at doing a particular field that's going to be a mixture of a cool season mixture of cover crops. And we're going to be planting that in the spring, and we're going to be grazing those animals hopefully as early as June, or depending on where you're located, and planting that cover crop mix multiple times. So I'm going to keep moving on so I can get to some of the grazing pieces. So here's a slide on seed sources. Green cover crop seed is out in Nebraska, and I highlight them because they do a really good job. That's their main goal, or main business is cover crops. So they can help you provide a mix, and a lot of growers have had a lot of success with the ease of going through them to identify what mixture makes sense. Wheatland seed, Rainier seed, Frontier seed in Moscow, Frontier, and Anders seed in Ontario. Those are just some that I've come across, or that growers I've worked with have come across. So that's something to note if you're looking for a seed source. So I wanted to showcase some quotes from producers that have worked with cover crops, because this really helps, again, highlight some information, some very useful information. So in my fall planting, I had the wheat and barley outcompete the broadleaves. Next time, I won't plant any grasses. So in this case, this particular grower, I believe he was grazing this mixture, and he realized that his cattle really liked the broadleafs. They really liked the brassicas. That was the most palatable species in that mix. But yet the grasses were starting to outcompete the brassicas in this case. Maybe his seeding rate of grasses was higher. And now he knows, you know what, I'm just going to focus on the brassicas or the broadleafs. That's what really benefited my production. My turnips came back strong in the spring, even after disking. So this can show a little bit about some of the species that are going to be vigorous and hardy. Some of our canola varieties that were supposedly winter kill did not winter kill. They were very hardy and survived into the throughout the winter and started growing in the spring. I don't think it's bad in most cases because our residue is not going to be that thick in the spring. But that's something to note, that the turnips came back strong in the spring, even after he disked it. I sold off all my tillage equipment. I'm using the tillage radish to do the job. So this is really interesting, where a grower has been able to see the benefits of the tillage radish, and he made that a prominent species in his mixture. And he was able to see his soil being aerated and work without actually having to come in and till. So that's a really exciting prospect for this grower, and being able to utilize, numerous conservation practices that are going to benefit his long-term soil health, minimizing the no-till and providing the cover crops. My fall planted turnips and radishes did great with low moisture. The vetch and clover also did really well with the low moisture conditions. So this is really interesting to see how cover crops do throughout Idaho, and especially under marginal conditions, under marginal land. Often growers that try cover crops for the first time typically pick a field that gets less attention, isn't their best producing field in general, so they're willing to kind of just throw that one to the wind for a year and just test these cover crops out. But they're really able to see some benefits that, although it was something that maybe they don't get to in terms of irrigation, or the water's cut off early, that these fall planted turnips and radishes did great with the low moisture. They were able to get enough biomass above ground to make it worth it for the grower and benefit the soil. And the vetch and clover also did well with those low moisture conditions. Here's an example a little bit opposite. Peas did good until the water ran out. Luckily, the grass in the mix kept the growth going. So peas are going to be a little bit more sensitive to low moisture conditions, but you can see some of these other species, such as the vetch, some of the brassica varieties, turnips and radishes, and the grasses are going to do better under low moisture or dry land conditions. Sudan grass is very drought tolerant, does worse when overwatered. So Sudan grass as well as permillet are both warm season annuals that do really well under dry conditions, and that's where they thrive best. So that's important for a lot of growers in our area, especially in south, central, as well as eastern and western Idaho. Another producer said, weather each year will play a role in how a grower decides to plant and manage the cover crops, and that is true. So you might start out one year with a plan, and as you see what the summer brings or the fall or winter brings, you'll be able to adjust and learn more as you start to observe how these species responded to the climatic conditions that year. In the spring, I saw higher moisture levels in the cover crop field compared to the fallow field, and this is the grower in my area who, using a marginal field, he was able to plant those cover crops, test it out, and he's able to really see a difference in the moisture, so that when he goes to plant in that field that he had those cover crops, he uses a no-till drill and plants barley. He was able to plant barley into that field, and that barley was able to capture moisture a lot sooner. So I know we just had a question period, but are there any specific questions about species selection? Maybe if there's none right now, I'll let you type some in, and I can come back to this question after a couple slides since we're running out of time. Jennifer, are there any questions so far?
There are not any new, there is one that just came in that says, I have heavy clay soil, any hints on a species?
I might work with a brassica or a grass species, and I would not want to work with a warm season such as the pearl millet or the Sudan grass, because they do not like wet feet. They're not going to want to be in soils really damp. So I'd look at a drought-tolerant grass species to help those fibrous roots break up that clay, create more porous space, and a brassica species with a dense taproot. So an example might be triticale and purple top turnip. So it could be an example of two really good species that would work out. And you could do a mixture of triticale, barley, purple top turnip, and a radish variety. That could be an example.
Okay, we had another question come in from Jody. Jody asks, what are good grass and brassica species recommendations for Palouse soils around Moscow?
Okay, this I know a lot of growers do well with the triticale in that area. Jennifer, do you know much about whether triticale, you being in northern Idaho, whether or wheat or barley, some varieties of those might be most suitable for that area?
I'm sure certainly the wheat and the barley. I know farther north in the Moscow area, one grower that successfully used triticale.
Okay. And then that individual also asked about brassicas.
Yes.
The brassicas do pretty well under most conditions we've discovered, so I would almost try out, you know, maybe the turnips and the radishes seem to be pretty hardy, so maybe I'd start with that, a purple top turnip or an oilseed radish, something like that, or a daikon radish. Those are examples that have been pretty hardy under most conditions, and I would just experiment with that under your soils.
Okay, thank you. That's the questions that we have for right now.
Okay. So I wanted to highlight grazing. This could be a whole nother topic, but I did want to highlight it, especially since many of you are on the call with grazing. That's really great. Grazing can be done with cover crops, whether that's poultry, pigs, cows, goats, sheep, whatever. And there's lots of, again, you're really going to look at a mixture because you're going to look at the diversity of the species and what type of nutrients they're going to provide to your particular animal species, and what nutrient requirements. But they can be essentially a good supplement, depending on how what type of animal you are or animal have, and that'll kind of determine what type of nutrients you need and how specific those animals, what nutrients they require. But can either be a supplement or your mainstay feed for a particular season. So Gabe Brown is a famous farmer in North Dakota, and I recently was lucky enough to see his presentation. He gave a talk in Burley, Idaho last week, and it was really interesting to see him. He's been essentially traveling around the world talking about cover crops because he's been able to use cover crops on his farm for over 10 years. And what's really neat is he has completely eliminated chemical fertilizer from his operation. He does not need it. His soil has, over those last 10 years of using cover crops, has been able to provide the nutrients that he needs for his crops or his pastures. And he's also able to build up that organic matter. And building up that organic matter in your soil essentially helps hold nutrients. So your nutrients are able to stay within your soil rather than being leached out within those organic clay particles or humus particles. So that Terry, who asked about doing a soil sample, as you start to increase your organic matter, which one is low, but at the same time in southern Idaho, 3% is really good for most farmers. But we can see farmers have as much as 6 or 8, and the organic matter is really what's going to capture your nutrients and keep it there. So Gabe Brown was really inspiring to see that he's able to completely eliminate the need for outside sources of fertilizer for his operation. He also has eliminated tillage. He maintains a till equipment. He said that. He says, I still want to keep it on my farm as a tool if I need it down the road, because again, we have to be resilient as climatic things might evolve or change or impact his farm. He still has tillage as a tool in his toolbox, but he has not had to use it over the last 10 years. So that's really interesting to note. And he has a diversified operation, which is why it works out really well. He has row crops, he has pasture setting where he's doing management intensive grazing, he has poultry, he has pigs, he has bees. He has a very diversified system, which is which is very pertinent for small farmers in Idaho. Often you are having diverse enterprises, which is why cover crops can work really well in those diverse operations. So I just want to highlight this individual farmer. You can look him up and find all sorts of information on him and his operation. Tons of YouTube videos as well. So I wanted to showcase some prices because that's always interesting to know how much you might spend or what a typical seed mix might look like. And this is a seed mix we did. Looks like I skipped a slide. This is a more complex seed mix we did, and we did it as both a forage mix and a cover crop mix. And we essentially, this is a real life bag of seed we bought. Winter triticale, flex forage pea, 4010 forage pea, Austrian winter pea, Wyndham winter pea, hairy vetch, starfire red clover, purple top turnip, and daikon soil buster radish. Again, you can see as you start to get on a phone with a seed dealer who knows cover crops, there's a lot of different varieties to choose under even just peas or vetches or clovers or turnips. So you really start to realize how many varieties are available to you, and they can talk to you about which ones farmers have had the most success with. So an example, we seeded this mix, a forage mix. At the top you can see we did a heavier rate of this forage mix because we wanted to maximize the forage. And in that case, we did 148 pounds the acre was our seeding rate, and this cost this particular grower $86 to the acre, which can be rather expensive on the high end for cover crops. That's not really what we advocate. We really want growers to be in that $20 to $30 range. But if you know what you're doing and you really want to maximize the forage, and you've been doing this for a couple of years, a grower then can really spend more knowing what species are going to do well and knowing that they're going to be able to pencil out that benefit on weight gain for their species. And we can also use the same mix, which we did as just a simple cover crop mix, and we lowered the seeding rate. And in this case, our seeding rate was 40 pounds to the acre. And as you'll note, each species has a different ratio in this mix, and your seed dealer can help you identify what ratio is going to be best depending on your management goals. And in that case, when we did that lower seeding rate, the cost went down significantly to $43 an acre. Now, again, as first-time cover croppers, we definitely want them to spend less money because we want to make sure they have success. And so you can really make a seed mix even simpler and cheaper. In this case, we took out some of the species and we decided to just create a mix with winter triticale, flex forage pea, Austrian winter pea, purple top turnip, and daikon soil buster. So again, we have 1 grass species, 2 legumes, and 2 brassicas. And in that case, we still wanted to plant a forage mix, so a grower still could graze this and get lots of good benefits in terms of tonnage. And in that case, we planted 60 pounds the acre, and it cost $42, which is significantly less than the slide previous, where it was up to $86 an hour. And again, this is still good maximum forage quality for grazing if that is your main management goal. Now, again, a grower might just want to make it a cover crop mix, and you could essentially take steal the same mixture, and you're looking at a lower seeding rate and 40 pounds the acre, and you're looking at $28. And that's where we really want to look at our management goals. So if you can be down to $20, especially as you try it out for the first time, that's what we ideally want. We want somewhere in that $20 to $30 range to make sure that you can seek the benefits you're looking for before you spend too much money, especially as you're experimenting, because the first season is definitely going to be looking and observing more or less. So grazing considerations real quick. We are going to look to warm season versus cool season plants, and that's going to depend on your grazing goals, whether you're looking for high crude protein or more or less tonnage. You're going to be looking at regrowth potential, and our grasses and brassicas and some of our cool season varieties are going to have better regrowth. Because again, if you're doing a management intensive grazing system, you're going to want to graze that pasture, especially if you planted in the spring and you're doing a full season planting. You're going to graze it, hopefully at a minimum 3 times and maybe even 4. And that's where you're going to pay attention to the regrowth potential of those species, because you want to make sure that you can come back to that same paddock 2 more times throughout the season to gain that tonnage. Management intensive grazing is definitely the most beneficial way to graze cover crops, because then you can control how the animal grazes those species. You can essentially help the animals graze at the appropriate level, 1 to 2 inches above the soil, before you move them to the next paddock. So essentially you're maximizing the benefit to your pasture by using a management intensive grazing system. And then optimal timing of feed is also important, because as the season progresses from your spring planting to the fall, the reproductive stage of those cover crop species are going to change. And so you're essentially trying to time your grazing with those optimal periods, and you want to start earlier than you think. So that's something we've experienced with growers, is that it's often a race, especially in a management intensive grazing, to get around the field, get to all those paddocks before any of those species have gone to their reproductive stage, where maybe they're not as ideal for grazing, and or might be more of an irritant to some of the to the animals as they burrow into feed. So again, optimal timing of feeding is important, and that can be talked about at another discussion, but I just wanted to highlight that. And then number of available animals is also important, because you want to maximize the grazing potential of that field. And if you can really get the most amount of animals on that field, you're gonna, again, your pasture is gonna benefit greater, because you're gonna graze those cover crops more evenly, and you're gonna spread out the benefit of the animal on that soil. So in summary, I hope that if you are interested in planting cover crops, that you're gonna start small, and I would select a species no more complex than 3 to 5 species, and again, keeping it in that $20 to $30 range, no more, or even less if you're able to do that, and just see how those species do on your field, and you'll start to see the characteristics of each of those species in the grasses and the brassicas and legumes, and then you'll start to understand what do you want to see more of, and then in that case you can start to adjust your mixture as you start to see what species do well, and which species you want to see more of or less of. Again, you want to keep the costs low the first time. Plant early is the biggest thing, making sure you can maximize the time for those species to grow, capture the energy from the sun, capture the nitrogen from the atmosphere, and provide all those benefits to the soil is really important, especially planting early is the benefit there. And then take soil samples and monitor. That's the really neat thing about cover crops, is if you take a soil sample or have an idea of what your soil is at now, start to monitor it as you've incorporated cover crops into your operation. I wanted to highlight that the next webinar in this series, your Small Farm 2018 webinar series, is next Monday, February 26th, and that's going to be Introduction to Idaho Farm Link. That's linking farm land, people who own land, with those who are interested in renting land or farming on land. That'll be done by Colette DePhelps. And I wanted to thank you for attending this webinar. And I'd love to answer any questions with the remaining time we have, but I also wanted to highlight my email addresses here, and I can answer any questions via email as well.
We do have a couple other questions.
Okay.
September had a couple questions. September wondered if they wanted specific coaching on their field. Is there someone that they could contact for that?
Where are they located?
Well, so she mentions, or September mentions, that they're in Malad. They're contemplating some land that has been in CRP for many years. They hope to do a cover crop or simple animal rotation there. Okay.
I would, if you know your county extension office, that would be a good start to identify someone that might be able to look at your land, or send them pictures and send them more specific information about your field. That would be a start. Do you have any other suggestions, Jennifer?
That would be my answer as well, unless you're already working with some sort of crop consultant that may also have information on cover crops.
And I will also mention, in addition to your local extension office, I would reach out to your NRCS field office. They do a lot with cover crops, which I did not get to mention further, was that there are, through EQIP, E-Q-I-P, if you Google NRCS cover crops, you can essentially find information on the programs that they help support. And there are cost share programs for farmers to implement cover crops. And in that case, if you do work with NRCS, they are hands-on and come to your field and help you get started with cover crops. So that might be a really good option for seeking that assistance.
Okay. Anna asks, would you recommend planting experimental plots of individual types of crops to see what works, what works best in your area?
No, I would not. I think you will get more bang for your buck if you launch in with a mixture, because what research has shown is that a mixture is better than one species. And so if you go ahead and just do one plot with a mixture, you're going to really see what species are going to do well in your climatic condition, and especially when they're mixed in with other species, because that's what you're ultimately going to do in most cases. Very rarely are you looking at planting one cover crop species. So in that case, I would narrow down maybe 3 to 5 species and just try it out on a small scale, and then see how those species interact together, because that's going to provide more information to you than if you planted each one individually.
Okay. Terry mentions that they just found these webinars, and I know we're recording the webinars, but is it possible to access the recordings from some of the previous webinars? Will those be posted?
Yes, they are recorded. This is the second one, so that would be on the Cultivating Success website. And after this webinar, you'll get an email to encourage you to take the survey. In addition to that, it'll send you a link when this webinar, when it's available via the recorded link. And I would go to that link, and that link should provide you with the other webinars that are recorded. And again, this is the second one, so as you go on in a couple weeks, there will be more on that list.
Okay, and the last one was from Amanda, who asked about the slides. Would they receive an email with the slides? And we mentioned in the beginning, we were sorry we didn't get that posted to the handouts, but you will receive an email with information on either a direct link to the slides or in the email itself.
Yes, that's correct. And please feel free to, I know each of you might have specific questions, and it really does vary, but please email me if you want with your specific situation and what you're trying to achieve, and I'll be certainly happy to help you as well. So I appreciate everyone taking the time tonight to attend this, and I really hope that you were able to have success with cover crops, and I hope this webinar was informative in helping you get started. And we would appreciate your feedback on these webinars so we know what works and what topics are interesting. So I encourage you to take the post-webinar series, or survey, excuse me, and we appreciate your time and attentiveness.
All right. See some thank yous in the question box here. And again, we do appreciate your time. Thank you, Lauren, for your presentation.
Thank you.
And I'll stop recording now.
Okay.